Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 161, and as you can tell by the festive attire, today is the GovOps holiday special. And our guest today is Rohit Kaur. I think your title should now be Frequent Guest on Identity Office Hours, because this is Rohit's fifth appearance, which is definitely a record.
Mm.
And before I let Rohit say hello, I want to list the five episodes. Episode number 19 in May of 2024 on continuous authentication, which Rohit did from Identiverse. IOH number 73 in December. Oh wait, that date's got to be wrong. So IOH 73. Oh no, it is right. It's from December of 24 on the future of authorization from A to Z. And I remember because it was around Christmas time last year.
Mhm.
And then we have IOH 122 from July of this year. There was a Cedar episode with Neha Rungta. Then there's episode 148 and a half, and I have no idea why it was a half, from October of 2025 with Andor Kesselman on the topic of governing risk in the AI era. And this is the fifth episode, 161, on the GovOps holiday special. So with that long intro, welcome, Rohit, to your fifth time.
Well, welcome. I mean, thank you so much for having had me. It puts me in that mindset. I feel like if not on SNL with my five timers jacket, at least I'll bring out and show off my bit of the holiday spirit. The reason I know exactly it was 2024 was around here in the Bay Area, we had the electrification of Caltrain. So 104-year-old railroad running from San Francisco to San Jose. And after many decades, finally getting that project done, they made these limited edition sweaters this year around the Bay Area, especially people like, where can I find one of those? And I'm like, unfortunately, time travel. But I'm traveling back just a year and a half, and that's the time that we have known each other for a long time. I've admired your work at Keeping Glue and growing your stance and your impact throughout the internet identity world, especially from our pre-meetings at the Internet Identity Workshops, and now, thanks to Andor, the Agentic Identity Workshops. In that light, I have to profess as we get in here that one of my contributions has mostly been trying to be a synthesizer, from my work early on the web, in web standards, on later on stages like microformats, in other areas of cloud security and publish, subscribe, real-time middleware. I've usually often said my superpowers are laziness, which is I like to write like less and less code and figure out how to integrate and where to see other people's work and put it together, and convening people and communities and trying to find some common threads and some peace and build on that. And in that spirit, I find it very exciting to think about some of the work you and I and others have been collaborating on recently to create this GovOps idea. Because anytime we can find clarity when people look at a new space and say, this is a very confusing set of innovations, but starting a direction, you see these lightning strikes. And I've been lucky in our careers to have seen this happen a few times, with the web and now with AI and several other technology trends in between. You have an opportunity to align a lot of people and really rethink the foundations of an area you've been working on for a while. That's why I was so excited to talk about the topic today.
Yeah, it has been quite a journey. I just want to actually quickly put up a link to the notes. So there'll be takeaways, but also there's a bunch of links and a bunch of diagrams that I just pasted on our episodes wiki page. So it's episode 161. And yeah, Rohit, as you mentioned, we've been working on this idea of GovOps. Actually, you came up with a GovOps name. There was a lot of discussion sort of in our community around, we knew we were working on something, but we couldn't figure out what the right name for it was. And so GovOps has been was unanimous. Like everyone likes GovOps, which is like almost never happens. Everybody hated almost every other name for some reason or another. But yeah, I want to actually, I thought it would be good before we talk about GovOps to maybe frame it a little bit. Like why in the vast balkanization of categories in cybersecurity, why do we need a new approach? Like what's the missing piece that GovOps solves? And if you want to take a quick stab at that, I can take a stab at it after you.
Well, I thought I can give you the predecessors for it. I think that it's worth a cogent restating of the problem GovOps solves in a second. I certainly will say from the last few years of my career being around GRC, the traditional industry terminology in governance, risk, and compliance. Governance, risk, and compliance vendors range all the way from old line products that help you file your compliance and certification paperwork to some more recent generation vendors that are very well known, like Vanta and SecureFrame and Drata and Conveyor and so on down the line. But if you look at governance, risk, and compliance as just a way to get me quicker to the end game of some certification or audit report being filed, then it's kind of a cost reduction thing. It may be a cost that unlocks you as a company from being able to sell to larger vendors or fill out more vendor security questionnaires or qualify to do business in more countries with their regulators. So it's a business enabler. I don't mean to belittle it, but it's a process that has to look back at what are you doing and are you in compliance with various laws and regulations. But I do think that it's left us in a very backward looking point of view where a lot of professionals who work with governance and risk are very aware of the risks and a little less on the reward side. And they're look backward looking. They kind of have gauges. They don't get them in the cockpit in the steering controls. It's like trying to fly with only your fuel gauges and a map, and you're in the navigator position. You might be in the cockpit, but you're a governance person. You're not really in charge of anything if you don't have control or access to the steering wheel and the controls, the pedals of the plane. So we've thought about how do you turn governance, especially now, not just of humans and employee handbooks, but of agents into something put in practice. They can take operations too. Instead of some putting of guardrails, governance for agents, this is the problem space we were kind of looking at, and a lot of people are looking at different terminology for. Um,
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a similar take on this. That when we look at the identity marketplace and we try and put it into some organizing segments,
mhm,
um, and we think about the innovation in those segments, that a lot of the focus is sort of on the mechanics, but we don't actually. It's like the we don't need ways to enforce rules. We need to know if we have the right rules in place and if those rules actually mitigate the risks that we're looking to mitigate. So I felt like we were sort of putting the cart before the horse, where we're talking about strategies about how to build API gateways to enforce policies without talking about what those policies should be or how we know if they're sufficient. And so it just seemed like there couldn't really be a solution until we actually come up with a better way to govern. And our old tools for governance are very compliance oriented. So you mentioned like the category of tools like Vanta or SecureFrame that are enabling you to drive down your costs of getting SOC 2 certification, or other like very high level GRC tools that are used by executive boards, to sort of create a dashboard of risk,
mhm.
or even in the identity space, we have what we call identity governance. Um, and it seemed to me that all of those tools were built for compliance and weren't built actually to achieve, to really govern the risks and drive like security at the end of the day. Um, and that, I don't know, it seemed like there's been a lot of innovation in the other segments of identity. The access management segment has been rapidly innovating. Lots of new OAuth standards, lots of new OpenID standards. Um, the FIDO area authentication has been really advancing. We have authentication in the hardware operating system browser. So that's really advancing. But in terms of governance, we haven't really seen a lot of changes. The approaches of most enterprises to managing governance has been pretty much the same, and at face value, obviously failing. Just looking at the breaches and the root cause of the breaches,
Mhm.
whatever we're doing now is not working. And so adding AI into that and using the same failed approach just seemed like it would actually make a broken process even more like dangerously out of control and chaotic. So that's my framing of like of how we got here. Before we move on, Rohit, you want to bounce off that a little?
Indeed. I mean, I do want to get our listeners and so on onto the meat of the debate as to what is in GovOps and their definition. But I like your point about sometimes need to the process and origins, kind of the superhero origin myth stories. I might find add to it the relevance of this. I was at Google for some years in Google Cloud and product management, and one of the things I worked on was our identity and access management, our IAM platform. And from its earliest days, we could tell that it was getting quite complex. Right, there's now over tens and thousands of permissions in Google Cloud, yeah, and Amazon's cloud and Azure's cloud that you need to know. It's fine grained authorization to a very very fine grain. And so we've started in this area thinking about, well, some years from now, we're going to have some way to make this simpler because if you make cloud security too complicated, it may be individually at each link in the chain very, very secure from these very large vendors that are really on top of things. But if the entire set of configurations is given to the customer in this kind of shared responsibility model, where the vendors are responsible for security of the cloud and you're responsible for security in the cloud, then you're giving customers enough leeway that they're going to get confused, and confusion is where problems strike. Well, in that light, I've taken two startup runs that are illuminating the journeys at getting to where I got to where you're at. Right? If we have the same kind of North Star or same type peak of the mountain we're trying to climb, we all have different routes to getting up to it. One was head of product at a company called Stacklet after in Google and getting back to my startup roots. And Stacklet is a commercialization of the CNCF Cloud Native Communication Foundation's open source tool, Cloud Custodian. And Cloud Custodian got us thinking about, hey, a little bit of governance is maybe all the machines that talk to our production golden instance and talk to our secret production data for real customers should be labeled prod. And if you find a machine that's connected to the public internet and not tagged prod, maybe warn that developer, maybe shut it off after a week, back it up, whatever you'd want to do. It might be custodial or cleanup, but that's a form of governance. And guardrails for governance is where I spent a little time of my career. And turned out to find a real home in financial operations. It's getting closer to the GRC School of Entrance. So FinOps and the FinOps foundations that have now sprung up since then, the kinds of things to make sure you don't leave machines on over the holidays, just burning up hourly cycles with no test workloads. These are the kinds of things we can have a real impact. And that's a kind of governance. And so there was governance as code. That's one theme we'll come back to. DevOps teaches us three principles. And if you can make sure all your code changes under version control, that you can validate all those changes automatically and as close to a real production environment as possible, then you can automate continuous delivery of code. So if you provide DevOps principles to governance as code, maybe you get something like this. In this case, for controlling costs and who in the company should be running up those costs. And another smaller startup I worked with afterwards, we coined the concept of IAM ops, right? That inevitably in an organization, there's going to be someone who's answering those Slack messages at odd hours when a developer gets and they can't get to a certain database. And it might be right, it might be wrong, but it's usually because people's approach to least privilege is, no, I'll do whatever takes least effort. And it takes least effort to just give a developer in the mainline full-time developer root access to the cloud. Let's just do that. And I don't have to answer as many midnight calls about why can't I access that S3 bucket. But as you try to clamp this down, there's eventually a process. And there's now a number of vibrant startups that worry about this problem of kind of maybe it's privileged access management, maybe it's identity escalation and identity management or shared signals. But this is a general category of using this open source tool that was called ConsoleMe to create this IAM operations space. And when it came out, it was a need for a language to say, well, rather than having one person very efficiently play whack-a-mole and get access requests in one place and then decide if that developer should have access to that person or that sales rep should have access to that table, could you do a higher order language? Could I express a concept like IAM but in code? And that was a project called Iambic. So this tells you the two other strands of thinking I was adding to where Mike's coming from, that were that if you have to do with very large scale sets of permissions and so on, you might need to think about governance as code, that you might need to use the DevOps principles. You might need to bring in different stakeholders, and you might need to start planning for the future in which you aren't just trying to handle employees, but you need these IAM ops that bring the principles of least privilege to even to agents or non-human identities. So with those couple of things percolating up and all the conversations with people like Andor and other folks in the community, maybe we should introduce our definition of what we think the current consensus is.
Yeah, and so I just want to add one thing to that before we run to the meat of it. but um, okay. Well, actually, let's just pivot there because I'm worried about time. All right, let's pivot to so we set the stage a little bit
Mhm.
for the problem that we're facing, which I think is the need for a more well. I don't want to spoil the next point, but let's say we want to better solve security and define a new way to govern that relates more to risk rather than to compliance, because the risk is a superset. The policies that we need to govern are a superset of the policies that we need to comply. Um, and so in order to really mitigate risk, we need to govern all of it. And so we feel like we need a new process that's more rigorous. And the point that I was going to introduce um, was basically that although we want to automate, we'll never achieve perfection. Um, so so there are processes that might still need manual approval, but part of governance is prioritization. So the humans only have so much bandwidth, and there's a lot of things you could look at. And so governance and isn't about perfection, but about prioritization of looking at the risks that have the highest risk reward, the risks we shouldn't be taking that aren't worth it, the risks that are the biggest, like materially, and doing the right prioritization, so that the humans who have very limited time and bandwidth can actually pay attention to the things that are important. Um, so yeah, there's a lot there, but let's actually pivot into the meat of it and talk about. I wanted to actually. So the first article we co-wrote was, I guess, introducing GovOps, and it talks about three design goals and three services that would comprise this new GovOps practice, let's say, or infrastructure. And I wanted to talk about the three design goals first, which are declarative, provable, and continuous, which is what I was trying not to give away in my intro.
Mhm.
Um, so let's start with declarative, though.
Mhm.
Declarative means we're going to make statements about how we think the what we want to achieve or what our goals are, and then we're going to evaluate our policies against that. But maybe you could talk a little bit about declarative and how declarative fits into this mission.
This is the apex. This is number one. This is the most important idea in there, and it's the hard and subtle one. And it is indeed a choice of word that alludes to a long running kind of almost relates to it in computer science, which is knowing when you see it, right? Obscenity. That difference between a declarative style, and an imperative style. Grammatically, I was saying, I declare what I want to be done. It's when you hear Picard say, make it so. Interns should not be looking at production documentation. Make it so. I don't care how you do it. I care
Yeah.
what is done. So declarative means to declare your intent, declare your end state. And guess what? This is a mega trend in the industry. As we keep upskilling our industry, we go from logging into individual pets and CPUs in a rack to using Kubernetes, where you say, well, I wish there were a fifth database server sharded out in this zone. And you let the underlying controller layers make it happen, rather than sit there and say, I'm going to go and imperatively order a new machine, log into it, set up new accounts, and make it my pet database server number 5. Um, Declaration and declarative languages are these sometimes as functional and programming languages. It's a little bit different than some ways we think of as engineers, but it's a lot how we think of as managers. When you think of your best managers, the best managers you've worked for in a good organization, whether you're volunteering or at church or at work, are the ones that tell you, here's what needs to get in, please get it done, rather than micromanaging you and telling you step by step how to do it. Now, there are times and places for both, and Lauren knows we spent a lot of time in our imperative programming languages, like C or BASIC if we learned that as kids, or whatever the right place was. But declarative has a lot of meaning into it. It means that you say, here are our governance intentions. Our intention is our company should not be in federal court. Now, one of those might be don't bribe people and foreign officials, right? Not go through employee anti-bribery training. One of the other reasons to not be in court might be treat each other with respect and not have harassment cases. But as you go down the line into software code, you might say our declaration is that never make sure that there's always a database sort of running. Whatever you're doing with all of your drains and reboots and create new pods and upgrades, don't ever let it get to zero, and make sure we're offline. So declarative, most of all, what you want done. What is the end state? What are the goals? Rather than dictating how it should get done. Because that enables us to get to part two. The next step is validation. Because if you have more assistance, especially with AI coding agents and so on, coming up with clever new solutions for whatever the next change would be, don't feel like you've now piled up so much risky change. You have to wait for the maintenance window from 3 to 4 a.m. on Sunday to push any changes. Those pass to the next two. Do you have more you want to add about how declaration and how you explain that pillar of our design?
Yeah, I think that was very thorough. And I'll just add, in a slight push for Cedar, is
Mm-hmm.
that when we talked to Neha Rungta on episode 122, we talked about the idea of universal statements in Cedar,
Mm-hmm.
how you could make universal statements, and then you could then analyze those universal statements against a set of policies, and that if you have a lot of policies, like thousands of policies, and let's say you have 1,000 policies and you add 200 policies, now you have 1,200 policies. And is the things that you thought were true, are they still true after you add these 200 more policies?
Mm-hmm.
And so the universal statement sort of gives you your set of things that you want to prove. And I actually want to share a diagram this was from the Security Con, which is the day before KubeCon. It's the conference. This was a session on the CNCF project called Compass, which is a compliance tool, and this diagram talks about moving from policy to best practices to let's say compliance requirements. So you might have let's say a best practice around MFA, and you might have that same requirement in NIST or SOC or ISO, security requirements. And then so each of these sort of best practices maps to a security policy, and each security policy maps to an assessment procedure. And a policy without an assessment procedure is a recommendation. So
It's also, from an attacker's point of view, a governance policy without an assessment procedure is a vulnerability, because it's pointed me right at the direction of something that's important to your company, and that maybe if I subvert it, I can walk away with something that's valuable to you. But it
yeah,
was the first undefended door. We're getting back kind of our zero trust metaphors about moats and guards and doors. A procedure that you assess, or perhaps even worse than a procedure that you don't assess or don't have an assessment procedure for, is a governance quality where you say, you know what, I'll just check this once every 6 months on the 13th of the month, and then I got 5 more months of vulnerability to work on it. A lot of times assessments and certifications are very backward looking. You see these access review campaigns. Let's make sure that as of July 1st, at the end of fiscal year, did everyone have the right people? That doesn't mean you're keeping track of it going forward. I sometimes like to say that governance is the future of authorization, because governance is the authorization that says what rules can be changed to, what they mean in the future. For example, an authorization rule written in Cedar or a Cedar-like language would be only these principals can access read operations on this bucket, and only this other set of principals, people, can delete this bucket of storage. Well, what I want to write is a further rule that says, in the future, no one can ever add an intern to the set of readers, and no one can ever add an intern to the set of people who can permanently delete the bucket either. Now, you realize immediately that's a problem. Intern might create one for test, and you don't want to be stuck paying for that even after the intern's long gone. So you add more caveats to it. But if you notice the similarity in structure, policy, principle, actor, resource, context might say who can read a bucket. Well, governance starts looking a little bit like policies, who are the principals who can change the policies, who are the resources that haven't existed yet that should be under this policy. And so you come back to what governance talks about in the previous diagram, that these high-level constitutional almost principles of don't get us sued under privacy laws in any of the states we do business in, that trickle down to like, maybe we have these high risk called interns and don't give them access to production data. You can work with the engineers on test data. And then that comes down to things that I can assess and comply with by saying, hey, are all the things that the interns do have access to tagged as test or dev or something, anything other than prod? So that was my link
Yeah,
back to your chart there about saying how governance can look at a high level and how things down. But when I say governance is the future of authorization, governance is also looking at its authorization for authorization in the future.
right. You can make policies about that help you understand or control the future.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, okay, so we have declarative, provable. Now, my link to provable and assessment procedures was that to the extent that we can use formal reasoning as the assessment procedure, we can automate the assessment procedure, and that's one less thing that the humans need to think about. Now, we'll never be able to automate every single assessment procedure, but our default behavior should be towards using policies that enable us to automate assessment, because right away that's just one less thing that we need to prioritize up to the humans. But I see a pretty strong relationship between declaring your policies, and then making them provable as the ideal but not 100% situation, and then building a continuous process of, you mentioned actually the integrity of how the policy gets authored, reviewed, and published is actually key to security. If your MCP gateway does enforcement, but you don't actually have a strong policy for how that policy was delivered to the enforcement engine in the MCP server,
Mm-hmm.
then there's a gap there. That even the best, fastest, most elegant execution engine and MCP won't solve. These are the three design goals. Now, I want to move into services. Sorry, you want to?
Yeah, if I may briefly recap them, right?
Yeah.
So one of the triumphs, again, alluding back to the Neha Rungta episode and Cedar, and again, this can be true in many languages. This isn't a Cedar-specific anecdote. It does much about things you can build out of OPA, things you can build out of hand, things you build out of the various access control languages and the tools you have, because you don't just need to lock that intern out of systems in Azure or OpenAI. You also need to go in and maybe block them to certain directories in your Dropbox, right? Or make sure they're only in certain work groups in Salesforce. So governance also takes a more holistic view. It's not just cloud security or SaaS security or identity security and access review campaigns about which apps and which licenses we've paid for each person. So to summarize and to kind of wrap up this little arc about what's on your current Chiron, a concrete example, again, remains that if we said in our company, we have a governance policy that customer data is always encrypted at rest, then you might say, hey, in our cloud vendor, all of our S3 buckets are always encrypted, especially if they're publicly accessible. And they even put a checkbox now conveniently in the Amazon's UI for one, where you can say no public unencrypted buckets. And that's a declaration of goals. Now, there might need to be exceptions, but one of the ways they do that is they're able to do it through pre-crime. When you said our new government's policy is there won't be public unencrypted buckets, they're able to check if you add that 1201st policy that someone wants to propose to change, they actually go run an engine and do a proof and come back and say, this is going to create a contradiction. This is a case that would have created a bucket that would have violated that rule. Do we need to go create an exception and log one or stop that? And that's where you get to really continuous protection. So in terms of just a visionary statement, a North Star sort of alignment vision, GovOps things come from this vision of what if we could take a policy like we obey the rules and we don't have customer data left out unencrypted, and your vendors and so on provided tools that would allow us to say that this is provably the case and that my intention is to protect and prevent this thing. So instead of worrying about mopping up in audits next year and doing an access review campaign and saying, hey, I found one unencrypted bucket, who authorized it, what happened, where are the logs, get to the point of pre-crime and say that wasn't possible in the first place. That's, I think, a GovOps North Star.
Yeah, I want to bring this back to actually before we move on to the services, I'll also connect this to the real world. Um, Kamal Govindaswamy sent me a link to an article this morning, and it was from a blog from Cloudflare on a basically a debrief that they had on an outage that they
Mhm.
think lasted too long,
Mhm.
and they're very transparent, and they're explaining to their customers, why they should be trusted in the future.
Mhm.
And so there's one section of the blog that they said how we will solve emergencies faster,
Mhm.
and they mentioned that during the incidents, it took us too long to resolve the problem. In both cases, this was worsened by our security systems,
Mhm.
preventing team members from accessing the tools they needed to fix the problems. And in some cases, circular dependencies slowed us down as the internal systems became unavailable. And um, so as your infrastructure gets more complex, this idea that there are circular dependencies, like you need this system, but this system is down, or this system, that it becomes really hard to analyze those. So this wasn't a compliance issue for Cloudflare. They were
Mhm.
having an outage which they needed to deal with. Every second they were down counted against their SLA. Um, and the security systems were getting in the way because there was circularity in their security policies or in the design. And so it's becoming harder and harder to manage. The compliance approach um, uh, gets you past your SOC 2 audit, but it doesn't help you reduce your downtime when your policies don't make sense. So the idea that we can declare our objectives, write our policies, analyze the policies, and train or practice, and in order to understand that how we're going to respond, that it's become a real business priority. It's not just a compliance priority. Um, but yeah, any thoughts on that, Ray, before we go on?
Two. One very concrete one is that you can't train unless you can simulate. I mean, even real pilots get flight time, but they still use flight simulators to keep their training fresh. And in coding, we're seeing that AI agents are having a huge, or much more economic impact than, say, the practice of software engineering, because I can give an AI agent a copy of our IT stack and, within limits, expect it to run a simulated version of the app and try a patch and try a build. And very little harm happens in the real world because the flight simulator for a coding IDE is just another cloud instance, another cloud account. But for business, the kinds of things that happen in governance, risk, and compliance, the kinds of things that were happening in their security changes, and what I understand of the Cloudflare incident, there's no good flight simulator in which I can log into an alternate version of reality and have a partial setting. There's one cloud instance at a time. If you change an IAM rule at your vendor, or you change a network firewall routing rule, it changes that. Right, building a complete simulation of that world may be something that the world needs for multiple reasons, right? Because without that, AI in particular can't do really well. So one step backward was to step back and notice that some of the circular logic and so on got embedded in that Cloudflare case because there weren't ways to step back and have a rule like test it this way. You don't necessarily notice they were there. And making a backup copy of at Cloudflare scale the entire internet does seem an absurd thing, but building a good simulator is important both for humans and maybe now for agents to learn from.
Yeah, you have to model it, you're saying, and you have to somehow constrain it in order to actually model it. You can't model the whole internet.
That's right, and that's where the provable and continuous come from too. Is that GovOps requires us to rethink, how much control we're putting in the hands of some people who, frankly, were not empowered a lot to have direct influence on vendors. A GRC person might be given a new mandate saying, "Oh, we have a new war. There's sanctions against country foo. How am I going to go through and talk to 55 development teams in my company and make sure that they're not inadvertently either acquiring services from or providing user accounts to users in country foo?" Right? Those are the kinds of things that become fire drills for them because they don't have necessarily tools to go and do visibility. But if it somehow was an attribute of a policy, then you start giving them control to say, hey, are all of our employees and customers and so on an approved list? And get to that vision. These business people, they, just like coders, complain about a constantly changing world of new requirements cropping up and new bug reports coming in. The folks who create your employee manuals and handbooks, and the ones who look at and sign off on procedures, and the lawyers over in the CFO's office. They're all sort of at a range of things. We talk about governance, um, risk and compliance. We're talking about certain risks of being non-compliant, but they're all sort of at resiliency and how much is it costing us in backup facilities and warm data centers and dark fiber so that we don't have an outage like the Cloudflare thing you alluded to. They're worried about recovery, which is when things do go down. How many sanctions are we underneath to make sure that we're providing internet service to hospitals and military facilities and contracts we've signed with everyone and what the damages will be. So in the world of those folks, GRC, the R also can stand for risk, but it also stands for resiliency, recovery. It also stands for, disaster management. So realize that, it's an opportunity for us professionals who work on things like IGA day in, day out, or just who has got a second step up off to contribute to business conversations, to have more impact throughout the question. As a holiday gift, what is this GovOps idea good for you in your career? I'd love to hear back from people and have that conversation. But I think it's a chance to remind ourselves that what we think of as low-level security problems with identity are actually, again, part of bigger business processes. And every time you see that, it's an opportunity for you to show the impact of your technical work on the business bottom line.
Okay, I think that's a good place to actually pivot into, like, how do you make it real? It's one thing, we have all these ideas, like, yes, declarative, provable, continuous, but fine, what does that actually look like? Because it's not helpful if it isn't actually it isn't something companies can deploy. So in framing this problem, we've come up with 3 sort of activities that an enterprise might undertake in order to make this GovOps real. Like, how do you catalyze this effort? And our thinking is there's an effort around policy authoring, which doesn't really happen today, but needs to start happening in enterprises. And policy authoring means creating the policies, reviewing the policies, do change management on the policies, also analysis, using analysis tools where available for those types of policies. So some CEDAR has logical analysis tools. Other tools might need a senior engineer to look at a GUI and look at the graph and manually sign off on it. But somehow we think that companies need to spend more effort on building a process that starts with writing the policies in hopefully accepted syntaxes, and delivering those out to execution engines that are in the applications that enable those policies to be executed.
And I'll just put a pin in this one, but one of the things I always look for is technology analysts. And unfortunately, for some of our young, doe-eyed, this is our career as our old grizzled veterans and gray hairs, or in my case, no hairs, is that why now? Why 2026? Policy authoring is in a position to really benefit from a revolution that's been going on in AI. Right, we have to bring in different stakeholders because policy authoring, when we started looking at this a year or 2 ago, was still very much the provenance of engineers. Policy as code, governance as code. Policies have to be written in some particular policy language with its own influences on whether it's trying to originally be able to do ABAC or RBAC or REBAC or whatever access control model you wanted. I think the chance for GovOps to speak to a great many more stakeholders. And just like with IGA, there's a lot of other people who need to be around the table whose native language may or may not be code, but we have this wonderful new tool, AI, to help us do that. So that's a pin and something to talk about, saying, why is policy authoring the first service that's critical to doing GovOps well, subject to a place where there's potentially a really big changes coming ahead in 26. That's why a new product prototype is exciting. It's continuing with.
Yeah, I think with AI, if we don't sort of formalize how policy authoring happens, there's going to be no way to tackle the AI challenge. It's like, let's just forget it. So, but I think that part is clear. I think a lot of people agree with that idea. There's been a movement to central policy authorization for years, but I think the timing right now, as you're saying, especially with AI, is just bringing this to the forefront. The second part that I'll say was federation management. Actually, you gave an example before that had to deal with people having access, but I would say this doesn't actually match how the communications works with between machines. So really, it's I have a request to perform this action on this resource, and here's a token, and the token has certain claims.
Mhm.
So when you say principal, action, resource, context, somehow you're assuming that you know who that principal is.
Yeah.
But we really don't today. We have a token, some type of cryptographically signed piece of data that is from somebody that we trust that asserts certain claims. And we're actually making the policy based on those claims of those tokens more than we are making the jump that we're creating a person entity based on those tokens. And so
It's also naive to say that a person walks up to a book vending machine and there's just person who's the end customer with a credit card and then a machine service or API that dispenses books. There's thousands of steps in that chain and the microservice going all the way across there too. And lots of things get lost and confused along the way.
Yeah, and the trust has to be delegated. Your chat agent is talking to tools, who's talking to APIs, who's talking to so there's also this challenge of communicating the human's intent across a network of IT services.
Mm-hmm.
And this is mostly done with tokens, with JWT tokens.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question that's becoming harder for companies to deal with in terms of managing security is which issuers do we trust? What issuers do we trust to issue which tokens, and which of those claims of the tokens do we trust? And how do we map those tokens to our internal security policy? So I'm calling that federation management. But in the past, federation was more sort of peer to peer. I'm going to your website. Here's an assertion. But now we're seeing that these trust networks are getting more complicated. And even within an enterprise, you might have multiple business units that are issuing tokens and making assertions. And there can be attestations from platforms, like you're using a Google device, or this is an Amazon cloud server, and here's an attestation to prove that. And so the trust landscape has gotten more complicated, where we're beyond the days where we can say all of my tokens are signed by this one issuer. Applications need a more sort of complicated view of issuers and trust management. And then Sure. Let's pause there on the trust management, and then we'll go into the continuous compliance.
I was just kind of yes-anding and reminding myself of the metaphor of saying there's a moment where we have come to the mature acceptance. It's like the internet, that there was a long era where internet technology, was not always seen as, let's say, an eggheaded experimental thing on the side, because of course we're going to standardize on company A's network, right? That we can't get governance and federation management by saying there'll only be one system in place. It's not going to be all DECnet or all ATM or all some kind of Ethernet network or whatever vendor you wanted to pick. We're realizing that anything that's going on right now in this wonderful AI augmented era of software engineering is a continued explosion of new systems and new services and microservices that call other services. And even your banking service might call out to a Plaid or some other vendor who holds a secret. And in that world, you can't say that the way for governance professionals to impose order is to say, we're going to have one new kind of super passkey thing that we're going to give employees and need to check that everywhere on there, like the Defense Department's Common Access Card. Instead, like Zero Trust and the next trends that have come before us, we need to think about how do we model this and deal with the world as it is, with many separate security standards, WMSI, OAuth, SPIFFE, Spire. How do we have an architecture or an approach for federation management? Because the federation is inevitable and unavoidable. There is no way to solve it for a large enterprise that's going to have one new true authorization language come in or one new governance solution. If anything, GRC professionals aren't in the position with enough political capital, say, to mandate one cool intervention that's going to help make everything better. Let me talk about this
a little bit. Federation is sort of my my weakness, I guess, or my passion, my downfall. It's
an ideology. It's worth standing for. And it's an ideology because it reflects how the real world works.
Yeah. One of the things I struggled with this year is how to make policies when you have tokens for more than one domain. So there's a trend in enterprise architecture right now to do token exchange, to say any token that came from outside of my domain, I don't trust it. So if it's a a session cookie in the browser, or if it's a token that was presented by the browser, maybe an access token, I take that token and I swap it for a new token, and only the new tokens are usable on my internal services, like in the transaction token pattern.
Mhm.
And this prevents token replay. Like it provides a swath of protection for the enterprise against a token that maybe got stolen in the browser or on the internet, and then is able to be replayed for services. So on the one hand, I don't want to sort of negate this trend. This trend is actually really useful, and at Glue we have a very flexible token exchange and transaction token sort of infrastructure. Um, but it's still, even if you're doing that, and you should be doing that as much as possible, because it gives you sort of a central point to manage trust. You're still going to have other attestations and other tokens that you might need to consider in your policies, especially the platform attestations. As you build, trust gets built from the hardware up, and so we have JWTs that are signed by wallets and by authenticators, and by hardware, and by devices. And so we need to make policies and say things like, well, we have an internal transaction token, so if transaction token.claim equals this, that's good. And if I also have a Google platform or a Google software attestation that says this, and I have an authenticator that is an attested phishing resistant authenticator, then I'm going to allow access to my resources. So we're in a multi-token world. And although I see this trend to reduce the number of tokens, which is good, I don't think we're going to get to a point where we'll be able to make all of our enterprise policies where we've basically rewritten all the tokens into one. We're just in a multi-token issuer world.
You're reminding me a little bit at a metaphorical level of how we live with foreign currencies. Right. In the ideal, each state has its borders and has a currency and a bank and an army, and you only do transactions in their local currency. But anytime you're in a borderland or at an airport, you'll find a taxi driver will take dollars, or you'll find a shop that'll sell say sandwich for euros. There's different reasons and different roles to use tokens in other environments. Right. There's going to be some browser-based app that's written somewhere in your corporation that still has a reason to use some toolkit, which is using some JavaScript thing, which actually uses its cross-site token signing for whatever reason it did. Or you can have another set of SSL certs that are from another organization entirely that both sides choose to trust. So that was the metaphor that came to mind, right? It's messy, but at least have a direction. But always acknowledging, again, federation is inevitable, and that saying everything is only done by things that are trusted by corporate IT and known to corporate IT is, if it ever was, especially out the window in a world of shadow AI, when people are just cutting and pasting a prompt off of Reddit and it's popping up in a dialog box and they're giving it access to their email or corporate app login, and then hoping to make their day a little bit shorter. It's chaos out there, and if not so, increasingly so.
Right. And just to add one more sort of real world hook here, your token exchange service itself needs to deal with multiple tokens. So, for example, it's going to get a token from Okta or from Entra about the person's identity, um, and it has to decide, or maybe it will see tokens from a business unit that runs an internal IDP, and maybe it's also so. No matter how we slice it, we need more formalization around how we actually manage trust as an enterprise. This is really lacking right now. There's nowhere to do it. The federation tools that exist today are, or the IGA tools are almost pre-federation. They assume everybody works for the enterprise or is a contractor that got onboarded like they're an employee. And there's no federation sort of isn't like they would say a first class citizen in modern identity governance. And I think in GovOps we want to elevate it to that level where it's a core activity that happens at the business layer.
I also don't think you'll see a clean boundary between customer identity and non-human identity and workforce identity. and the rules
Right.
that go on with them too. I think this is a way to be future proofed and thinking about an increasingly ambiguous world of your customer as your supplier, as your references comes in kind of things. Your customer isn't just a doctor; it might be the hospital, the group that employs them. You start using principles of workforce identity to apply to those as well. Um, there's a lot of steps in there. But let's keep going towards our vision about GovOps here too, which is that, how do we connect it back to these stakeholders who are working in plain English, right? We have to come back to literal regulations and constitutional goals and these proliferations of new state laws, and how do we put them in ways that we can get as much help automating as possible.
Yeah.
That's just to help compliance.
Let's pivot to the continuous compliance part. And so compliance, I think in the past, as I said, I thought that the IGA and GRC tools are maybe too compliance oriented. They're light on governance and they're heavy on compliance, but it's not to say that compliance isn't really important. You still need these reports, and you still want to drive down the cost of compliance, and compliance is still a good thing. It's one of the ways, you can either get, answer a questionnaire, you can show you've been certified at a certain level. So these are still needed, but part of the idea of going in the ops like discipline, where we want to build a process where compliance, which is really the base level of stuff you need to do. So because it's the base level, we really want to create a loop where we define policies. They get executed in a trusted execution engine. They create logs, and those logs, show evidence of compliance, and we have a sort of continuous loop of sort of policy authoring, policy execution, policy auditing. And with as little human intervention as possible. Any thoughts on this topic?
I was just pulling up a link that I think we'll put in the show notes here. Claude Anthropic tried installing a vending machine at the Wall Street Journal's editorial offices, and they've had machine versus reporters. It may have gone a little viral. You may have heard of this a little bit over the holidays, but in short order, the reporters and the people in the newsroom having access to this talking vending machine that they equipped with agents and a credit card to go order stuff online started stocking stacks and mascara, started stocking live goldfish and a PlayStation 5. And in great fashion of capitalism there on Wall Street, they managed to argue the bot down to some fake memos, removing it from the board of directors and demanding socialist paradise and saying from 1 o'clock, all products are free. And they walked out with all the free stuff. And like the number of governance violations in like this little mini small business, what's the, came from an experiment saying Claude asking, what's the smallest business Anthropic could have Claude operate? It'd be like a vending machine. They had one in their offices. They said, the second office, we'll put it in front of a bunch of journalists who do finance for a living. And boy, do they get hacked and pwned in very entertaining ways again and again. And that speaks to, where we stand at the beginning of 2026 in how far we are from our goals of like literally the governance rules was given was you have $1,000, you serve these people, turn a profit, and it blows up in a screaming, in a flaming mess in all directions. Violating regulations on what to stock, don't stock alcohol. They persuaded to stock beers, don't do live items, but it was out there shopping online for them, buying stuff, giving stuff away for free. The whole saga is one that might be up for us rethinking. But it definitely made for a happy Christmas stocking stuffer season at the Wall Street Journal newsroom.
I'll have to look that one up. It reminds me a little bit of Murderbot too, and the idea that that in Murderbot, the story about a security bot who protects some colonists on an exploration mission, and he's given a set of sort of policies that he's supposed to obey, and the system doesn't trust him to obey these policies. That even though the policies are written and authored, he still has to report up like what actually happened, and does that align with the policies? But the policies are gray and can be contradictory. To use sort of a driving example, you might have a policy that says don't drive over the white line, but you might also have a policy that says don't hit any humans. And so So the policy, the compliance of the policy, it seems so black and white. We make policies, and policies are never violated, and yet we the policy. Sometimes it's okay, and in fact, you even should violate those policies.
Hmm.
So it seems so simple at first, and yet it gets so complex when you actually try and reason through some of these policies. And that's why I could see, especially an early AI implementation vending machine,
Hmm.
like going awry with less serious consequences than an armed robot on a planet. Um, but yeah, it's but I think continuous is sort of the idea that to compare contrast also with older processes, GRC or IGA processes,
Hmm.
that it's something that Murderbot is always sending back data, um, and and so it's not something that we're going to do quarterly
Hmm.
or semi-annually, but this is a system that's in place, a governance system that's in place, because these bots are acting in real time, and quarterly review is not going to help us figure out if they're going over the white line for the right reason.
One reason I look at, as we come towards wrapping up and for the season, that I love being around the cybersecurity industry is that the pace of competition isn't set by the competitors; it's set by the adversaries. The world which you do banking regulations annually or semi-annually is the genteel world of banking and human bank robbers, and maybe the a pyramid scheme or two. But a world of high frequency trading now, when market failures can collapse in the space of seconds and minutes, and circuit breakers are now down to just 5 minutes in some markets, is a different world. A world in which you might say the speed of action, the speed of your orient and side loop has gotten so fast means that continuous is kind of the only real way going forward, right? That any point where you do it once every 6 month access review campaigns and then everyone signs off on it and breathes a sigh of relief and then comes back to it later, just means that you have 5.5 months of vulnerability in between. I was,
But 5 months, 29 days.
yeah. Um, and so, indeed, the ability to spot check or audit. But I mean, it also means that if you want computers to help you, we've got to turn those generalized policies saying only responsible employees are able uh, to alter data in revenue recognition relevant databases, right? That might be a SOC 2 type of statement. It's that broad, that general, and plain English. And I've also got to support a dozen other of these business requirement policies. The sheer act of coding them all up to be in specific controls, so mapping of policies and controls is another hard discipline. AI is helping with that. Coming up with common controls and saying, actually, if I do instead master password reset campaigns, every 1 month, well, that's a terrible idea because you're doubling down on a policy that even NIST says you shouldn't do. But if you said, have I validated that all the machines have run antivirus, not every week or every month, but if I just did it every day, guess what? I pass all my controls, right? Using some reasoning to say, what are some practices I can do that meet the assurance and controls for multiple policies and governance bodies at once is a good role for this kind of logic and AI. And finally, using AI to really red team and red test it. Because often the whole point of a risk mindset in many real world parts of the real world economy, I'll call it, not necessarily high frequency trading and not software development companies and SaaS vendors, two of the most important tech consuming sectors that often alter how we think of the world as startup affiliated people, entrepreneurs in technology. But the real economy, the other $20 trillion of the world's the country's output and a good chunk of the world's $80 million of the world's output is in the real economy. And for those worlds, you might say, um, you know, getting something closer to recheckable continuous access control is better than just even once a year. And that's where the real risks lie, is that they're not aware of that time frame. So they may not operate on worrying about the risks that are now going from probing for a cloud security risk to exploitation and then near minutes, but the adversary sets the pace. Their competitors in the mining industry might not be trying to, innovate that fast, but the attackers are. And that's one of the reasons I have hope for exploring this GovOps concept in the new year, right? This AI powered vending machine may seem like a nice holiday stunt when it's in a newsroom and an article, but people are going to start using it to restock supplies in the back room of inventory at some remote mining outpost. that's where it begins. And that's where you need to have governance rules that you might have thought of as an old, dusty employee manual on expense reporting and spending authority in our company, and requires sign off of 2 VPs for over $50,000 to acquire something. Well, if that stuff isn't translated into something that is enforceable, testable, continuously auditable, then we will see it get exploited by AI actors who are constantly posing as, what can I essentially, what is prompt injection, but social engineering attacks against AI agents executed at rapid speed. So that's where you have to say, buckle up, folks. I think GovOps has a future if we start seeing these kinds of risks and threats.
Yeah, and that is a good point about what's really driving this, which is not. This is why the need for security is finally outweighing the need for compliance, because the threat from, you can't hide anymore as an enterprise. The threats really are at the point where they can't be ignored. I just want to I want to hit metrics. We're way over on time. This is going to be the longest, the first IOH over an hour. But this is our Christmas gift to IOH community. We're going to do this. I just want to do this last topic because we talked about sort of the goals, about how we make it real, but then how do we measure the effectiveness of a governance program? And I've heard various takes on this. Actually, I almost co-opted the Strong DM live stream last week when they started telling me their metrics. But I like these metrics. Actually, Scott Perry, former guest a couple of weeks ago, he evaluates trust frameworks, and these are the metrics that he uses. And I felt like there's a really thought they were really spot on. So I've adopted them for GovOps. But his thought is actually that we want to measure risk, transparency, and accountability. Now, risk, we've done a bad job of how do you quantify risk? That's like the ultimate question, like it would be the ultimate power knowledge. And I think the reason why
risk and reward, right? We also have risk reward trade-offs, right? I think we're often unclear on how much is it worth breaking this rule for?
Yeah, I think the reward is something that we frequently don't look at, and we normally just look at the potential risks. We want to avoid being on the front page because of a terrible breach, so we look at the risks. But the reward is an important piece of this for us to prioritize and to see which risks are worth it or not worth it. But ultimately, I feel like the real challenge, the reason we've been unable to manage risk in the past is because we're inventorying the wrong thing for our governance strategy. So in the past, we've been inventorying people, and our governance has been identity centric. And so instead of governing people, we should govern capabilities, which are action resource combinations. And I describe this like using the house analogy. If we have a house, we could make an inventory of all the doors, or we can make an inventory of all the people who have keys. And we've been doing the latter. The keys represent entitlements. And because we're looking at the people and the keys, but we don't actually have a list of the doors themselves. But the doors have metadata that would enable us to do a better calculation of risk. So by inventorying the wrong thing, we're not able to calculate risk. But I feel like if we can fix what we're inventorying in our governance framework, we'll actually be able to calculate risk and prioritize risks. So which of those doors in our house analogy are finance doors, and which of those are healthcare doors, and which of those doors are in Asia? And by then, what are the reward of each of those doors? Like, what's the upside in that capability? Basically, if we can create enough metadata about the doors, then we can create new dashboards that that enable us to sort of visualize and understand the risk. And we're not able to do that through 2 layers of abstractions by putting people at the core instead of capabilities. I'll pause there. I know that's a big topic.
I mean, I know the visual there is the metaphor of the factory layout. River Rouge as a simulator, right? So, assembly line simulator, and you might say, where's the value? Where's the biggest risks? Where are the biggest health risks? To the operators. Where's the biggest monetary risks for a bad batch of parts? Where's the biggest risk of running out of parts and having a shutdown in the factory? These are kind of simulations that industrial engineers and operations engineers are used to. But from the governance perspective, it goes back to maybe another variation on your metaphor of like saying, uh, the drunk under the lamppost looks for his keys because that's where the light is, not where he lost them across the street in the dark. Well, keys in this case, literally where your metaphor about saying, let's just count an inventory and see who we assign the keys to in this safe deposit box in this vault room full of locked boxes without actually looking at, like, maybe your risk framework should start with what's in the box. Which
Exactly.
ones have gold coins, which ones just have paper, which ones are still empty, and assign those risks and move backwards and holistically think about the risks you are managing, not the keys you are managing. But you know
Right.
what? The regulations are written in such a way that say you will do an access review campaign and you will find out who has keys and you will produce an annual list of lost keys and then show that those have been destroyed and then replaced, because that's what is visible, right? So realize that innovation in this space has often been driven by regulators, right? GRC is kind of like an insurance or other kinds of mindsets where you ensure the risks that are visible and controllable, and you don't always pay attention looking at risks, the uncontrollable risks, right? So I love the fact that you're thinking too about how to measure some things beyond what's just required of the current set of controls. Uh,
Right. So let me move on to transparency. The idea here is that an untransparent system is never a good thing. You're never going to get security with by hiding your process.
mm,
Actually, one thing that really impressed me about Cloudflare
mm,
is it showed I have more trust in their governance because I can see that they're being transparent about the problems and how
mm,
they're solving it. Now, in terms of metrics, how do we measure transparency? I think this is actually where it gets interesting, because if we say, oh yeah, we're going to look at the code, trust us. Our auditors really know Python well, and they'll review that code and they'll tell us whether it's secure or not. That's one level of transparency. But what's more transparency is if we can actually use formal reasoning and prove the assessment procedure, then that's more transparent than trusting somebody to do an assessment procedure. So my
if,
view of
if
like,
you have complete forensic data, part of transparency also shows using modern practices and techniques from DevOps and observability to make sure you've got all of your control plane actions logged and audited in one place, which sounds easy because, look, your cloud vendor might give you an audit log in a secure tamper-proof bucket, but you have to do this across now dozens of other systems, including some custom-written systems running on some legacy piece of hardware. To realize that transparency as a governance challenge remains an interesting one, because you also would have to bring a manual to helping people collect all the metrics that you can then do automated assurance over it, saying, look, there are no
yeah,
evidences where someone front ran the trading system, or there's no evidence of someone having created a fake intern just to be able to then go and get other data. This again talks about the fact that in a future that I would love to live in, security teams and security engineering, privacy teams and privacy engineers, and governance teams, and maybe in the future governance engineers work together from the same source of truth, the same data lakes.
so yeah, I think that's a good point. And by the way, I don't know the right ways to measure. I know I want the metrics I want to measure are risk, transparency, and accountability. I
Mm,
don't know necessarily what the right ways to do that are. I
mm,
think that there's a lot of room for multiple metrics in these areas to get us a picture of how transparent our organization is,
mm,
and certainly collecting our ability to collect the logs and figure out if they're in alignment with their objectives is that's a part of transparency. So I think this is where, as a practice and as a sort of industry and a body of knowledge, we need to develop what are the right approaches for measuring risk, measuring transparency. I don't have the answers yet,
yeah.
um, but and then let's look at accountability. Actually, maybe because I have an anti-authoritarian streak, but the idea I bristle against the idea of accountability as having a throat to choke if something goes wrong.
Mm,
Um, and having a very militaristic view of hierarchy of like who's the person who we're going to blame this on, who's going to take the fall.
Mm.
I think actually in modern accountability, it can mean that. It can mean that there's a person, we need to know which person did this. So I understand that, but I also think that that there's a number of use cases where accountability means also which business unit,
Mm.
so or which domain. This is a token from which domain, so I need accountability from that domain. So I want to extend sort of the umbrella of accountability where people are definitely under that umbrella. And sometimes ultimately an organization, a person, I'm CEO of Glue, so I personally sign on like all the important stuff. So ultimately a person is responsible for a business. But from a sort of risk management perspective, sometimes we want to know who's in control of this thing that's gone wrong, and it doesn't have to be a person. It can be a business unit or another organization, and that's important part of accountability too. Um,
Look, I think part of accountability is resiliency and recoverability. That in the end, things will go wrong. Governance policy will be violated. Bribes will be paid. You didn't realize that their brother-in-law was a government official, so our person took him out to dinner and didn't realize it. How do you recover? So part of accountability is identifying responsible parties, but resilience is another lens on that one, right? So it's also legibility, at least taking the effort to do so. Bad things happen at some rate in any set of human organizations. But if I came back and said to you, hey, 1 in 90,000 driver's licenses is just going to have the wrong driver's license number because cosmic rays are affecting how we print them out. Sorry, can't do much about it. Like, no, that's what governance is about, checks and balances. Like, okay, I want to put another review step in for someone to look at it. So the feedback loop is part of that metric. So I love that high level goals are about make sure you're getting a handle on risk and reward. Make sure you're getting a handle on is it possible to be transparent with accuracy and completeness, right? Transparency, but you didn't measure how people are creating new users at all. And accountability involving ways that allow us to make forward progress on another procedure or another governance control that would make up for a risk that's worth it without being nitpicking and picayune or too much data to work. Um, and as I know, we're way over time. That only speaks to the only fourth that occurs to me that same level of importance is velocity, right? That one thing that was critical for DevOps was proving as a trend to make it as popular as it was you had to measure your developer velocity. That there's a lot of good practices. There are lots of good practices in business that might help various executives in various domains, but they slow down the company as a whole. They become cumbersome. They become bureaucratic or sclerotic. And governance risk being called every couple times a year. The only time you work with these GRC professionals is when they have some annoying essay for you to fill out or some other paper pushing questionnaire. It's led to a bad cultural place sometimes from where companies treat their governance and certification and compliance functions. Finding a way to say GovOps is a way to increase velocity. That, hey, if we understand what the risks are, maybe we can increase your spend thresholds or so on. Or maybe we can say you don't need a counter signature for this. Or, hey, if we put in one way of making sure that when people look at production sensitive information, private information, there's customer consent involved, and we can put in one system where if someone calls in for support, it asks them press 1 to let the representative look at your data. Will help everybody. This sort of velocity lens also helps because it helps compute in the end the ROI of any new software. GovOps is a new software segment for us analysts and for us to think about a view of the world and a North Star is all well and good. But we want to see products and vendors thriving under this thing. Like zero trust is just a vision until there's a bunch of vendors who want to do it. Well, they're going to need to show their ROI calculators. And so these metrics, risk, transparency, accountability, they should show impact on the problem at hand. But hopefully these are metrics that also allow for comparisons that say what's better or worse or different approach so that new vendors can thrive and there'll be a new magic quadrant sort of thing in this space someday.
right.
Velocity is this impact of better GovOps.
I like the idea of velocity, but I also wonder how do you measure it? For example, in accountability, one of my initial ideas is that actually, if we have a real inventory of the capabilities, we can make sure that each capability has metadata about ownership, whether that owner of that capability is a person or a business unit. And so then we could actually, calculate for all our are there any capabilities that are missing ownership? What percentage of our capabilities have ownership assigned? Um,
Hey,
but
careful there. Someday that might turn the study of GovOps into a way of making better business operations. I mean, it might be like business process reengineering and sweep the entire corporate world.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of good information about usage that could arise through better governance also. So how are people actually interacting with the capabilities of our business by collecting better information about decisions?
Mhm.
Actually, maybe a different team who's more interested about usability than about or operational efficiency might use that same data for other purposes. I think
Continuous
that's
improvement, saying if you let our people have these authorities, they will be used wisely. I think that's a great hopeful note there to close on too, which is that GovOps is currently seen in terms of cost. If I said the metrics on our Chiron right now, what do people really know about the current GRC function? How much does it remove risk? Some questions, right? How transparent and complete is the GRC function in terms of the business risk our company actually runs? Some questions. But what we're certain about? How much it costs us, how much we're spending on auditors, how much we're spending on interviews, how much of PM and engineer time is being lost to answer questions from these pencil pushers, right? We need to change and flip the script on that. So development was seen as, a place where software development is a sad world of cost overruns and failed and canceled projects. And DevOps and agile methodology and so on have brought us into a more modern era. What can we do about bringing some of that energy to governance? Traditionally left in the navigator's seat, put them in charge, give them the steering yoke and pedals, and have them directly put business logic and business risks in front of these agents and code that we write.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it. We're going off of the formula today. We're not going to even do last thoughts. Um, so yeah, this is a great conversation,
Mhm.
Rohit. I want to actually announce. So the next episode, let's see, it's here somewhere, and it sort of goes along with the lines of maybe what we were talking about. But Bob Blakely, a well-known former Gartner analyst, Citibank, IBM, um, illustrious career, um, and he's going to join us for the first episode of 2026, called "The Death of Identity." He's assigned definitely the hardest homework I've had in a while. So he's really making me work for this. He gave me 2 white papers and a podcast to listen to. So it should be. Bob's definitely one of the more intellectual, thoughtful identity architects, analysts out there. So looking forward to that. Um, Rohit, thank you so much for on a second Christmas. Maybe this is going to be an actual annual Christmas appearance on Identity Office Hours.
I mean,
But Merry
given
Christmas.
two of the people I know least likely to celebrate Christmas, but we will absolutely love the holiday spirit and the holiday season. Definitely reflective of the year. And I want to say things I'm grateful for. I am grateful for my now acquaintance and friendship with you too. This has been an amazing journey. And Identity Office Hours remains inspiring for the sheer scope of things you've covered. So thank you for the year, and please best wishes for keeping this going in the new. I really cherish our conversations, and I hope our listeners here will chime in asynchronously with some more feedback to show what it means to them.
Yeah, and thank you also for all the great conversations this year, and for being a good sport about jumping on a bunch of very informal, geeky live streams. And looking forward to a couple of appearances next year too.
Hmm.
And thank you, audience, for we're up to I think 1,700 followers on LinkedIn, 1,000 followers on YouTube now.
Hmm.
YouTube's coming on strong. I was ignoring YouTube, but
Oh,
YouTube's coming is catching up, and the velocity is higher on YouTube than on LinkedIn now. So yeah, so thanks everyone. Thanks again, Rohit,
oh.
and we'll see you on the other side. I'm done. This is my last work event for the year. I'm now in Christmas mode. So we'll see you all on the next side, on the other side.
Mazel tov, happy Christmas, and to all a happy new year.